head. So be it. Blessed be. And amen. I have a story for all ages, and it comes from the country of Uganda in Africa. And I learned it from a religious educator, a Unitarian Universalist religious educator named Sophia Lyon Foz. Some of you may have heard of her. And the story is my retelling of it. It's called The Boy Who Was Afraid to Try. Kumba was a young African boy. They say that he lived in a small village with his parents. And they say that his parents loved him very much, but they worried about him a lot. You see, Kumba was afraid of just about everything. For one thing, he was small for his age, and he had trouble keeping up with the other kids in the village when they were running around. And because of this, sometimes the other kids teased him, and that's how his fears got started. And because he was afraid, Kumba started keeping completely to himself. He stayed alone, and the longer he kept to himself, the more afraid he became. Eventually, he became afraid to try anything because he was afraid all the kids would laugh at him and the grown-ups would criticize whatever he tried to do. So he could have worked with his father making pots of clay. He could have worked with his mother learning to dig in the garden. But instead, Kumba spent all of his time wandering in the fields around the village and wishing things were different. Because of that, all the people in the village began to wonder, what is wrong with Kumba? One night when he was supposed to be asleep, he heard his parents talking about him, and they were talking about just how worried they were about their son. Maybe there really was something wrong with him, they said, because he never did anything or went anywhere. They were afraid maybe it meant that he really wasn't very bright. Well, Kumba was shocked to hear his parents talking about him like that. Inside, he knew he was bright. It was just that he was so afraid of the other kids, so afraid of what people thought of him. That's what kept him alone by himself. One evening, he was feeling especially sad, and he left his family's hut and wandered off by himself into the woods. He sat down where he could watch the sunset, and it was a beautiful sunset, but instead of enjoying it, he put his face in his hands and started to sob. Oh. Well, pretty soon, a lion heard him crying and came out of the woods. The lion walked over to Kumba and asked, "What are you doing here, my young friend? Aren't you supposed to be sleeping?" "Oh," said Kumba, "I'm feeling so miserable. I'm so afraid of everything in my village and everyone and what they think of me, and I'm afraid to try anything or do anything. I have no friends. I don't do anything interesting, not very smart." "Well," said the lion, "if I may make a suggestion, instead of worrying so much about what people think of you, why don't you think instead about how you can help other people? And that may end up helping you." And the lion turned around and went back into the woods. Soon afterwards, an antelope appeared over the hillside. And she asked Kumba, "What are you doing here, my young friend?" And Kumba gave the antelope the same reply he had given the lion. "I'm feeling miserable. I'm so afraid. I'm afraid to do anything. I have no friends. I can't do anything interesting. And people think I'm not very smart." And the antelope noticed how thin Kumba was, and they said, "What do you eat?" And Kumba replied, "Well, my mother cooks 3 meals for me every day, and I eat them." "Well," said the antelope, "do you ever thank your mother for the meals she prepares?" Kumba thought about this. "No, I guess I don't," he said. "Well," said the antelope, "I have a suggestion. The next time your mother sets a meal in front of you, why don't you say thank you?" And the antelope leapt away back into the woods. Next, a leopard appeared. When the leopard saw Kumba, he was surprised. "What are you doing here, my young friend?" And Kumba gave the leopard the same reply he'd given the lion. And the antelope, "I'm feeling miserable. I'm so afraid. I have no friends. I never do anything interesting. And people think I'm not very bright." The leopard asked, "Well, do the other kids in the village like you?" "Oh," Kumba replied, "no, I don't think they do. And I don't care, because they're mean to me, and I don't like them." "Well," said the leopard, "I have a suggestion for you. Everyone likes to play. You're missing out on something. So why don't you just go play with the other children and concentrate on enjoying the play? Forget about what anybody might think of you." And the leopard turned around and went back into the woods. Well, Kumba was very tired from his walk into the woods and from all his crying and from meeting 3 wild animals, which he hadn't quite expected. So he lay down right where he was and fell asleep. When he woke up, the sun was shining on him, and he knew it was morning. And as he walked back into the village, he thought about what the lion and the antelope and the leopard had said to him. And their suggestions seemed sensible. They involved such small steps. Maybe he should try them. It wouldn't hurt, right? So he walked back into the village, and the first person he saw was his mother. "Good morning, Mama," he said with a big smile on his face. And when she gave him his breakfast, he said, "This is delicious. Thank you." And he gave her a big hug. After breakfast, he asked her if he could help her dig yams in the garden. And she said yes, and she showed him how. When they were done digging yams, Kumba saw all the kids playing in the village center, and he ran to join them. He did fall behind once or twice, but he didn't give up. He kept going. Later that day, he asked his father to show him how to make pots. And his father was glad to show him, and they worked together until dinner. Well, at the end of the day, you know what? Kumba realized something amazing. He'd been so busy all day and had enjoyed everything he did that he had totally forgotten how afraid he was. The advice the animals gave him was so simple, just a few small steps, and it worked. And he promised himself that he'd take those same steps the next day and the next and the day after that. And soon he realized that he not only felt better, he actually felt happy. And so Kumba didn't stop feeling afraid all at once. His fears continued to return to him from time to time. But little by little, with a few small steps at a time, he found himself being just a little bit braver every day. And the braver he got, the happier he became. So that's my telling of an African folk tale. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much. Do you all know that Edvard Grieg was a Unitarian? Both he and his wife Nina. They discovered Unitarianism as adults, I think, and they were loyal Unitarians, I think, the rest of their lives. So, little small fact that's nice to know. So, let me just say, it's really nice to be back here again. Some of you may have seen me on video a couple of times, and it's really good to be here in person. So, an hour and a half northeast of here, outside Taos, there's a 50-mile canyon, the Rio Grande Gorge. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Named for the river that runs through it, the gorge, tectonic Rio Grande rift that bisects our state. And a bridge spans the gorge near Taos. It can be crossed either by car or on foot. It's called, no surprise, the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge. Well, it turns out that this bridge is the fifth tallest span in the United States, and it's the second highest in the nation of any bridge passing over a state highway. Years before I moved to New Mexico in 2012, I took a writing workshop in Taos. It was in the mid-90s. During our afternoon free time, another participant named Emily asked me if I'd like to go on a drive to see the gorge. I didn't know anything about the gorge, but I was always game to explore, so I didn't give it a second thought. Sure, why not? I replied. After a short drive, we arrived at the gorge and parked our car in a small lot near the bridge abutment. From this vantage point, there really wasn't very much to see. We saw a great brown expanse of land and a pair of concrete railings framing the highway, but not much else. So I thought to myself, this is the gorge. Doesn't seem like a big deal. Nonchalantly, I started across. Then I looked down. Without warning, my whole world changed. What had been solid ground under my feet became nothing. Suddenly, we were suspended in midair. Below us was a gaping chasm. The river, the Rio, 650 feet below, was barely visible. The only thing separating us from a long drop was that bridge and its rather skimpy-looking railing. So, no big deal turned suddenly into, oh my God. From within me rose up a bubble of pure terror. It felt as though a flock of birds were taking off inside my chest. They escaped, along with a gasp. Meanwhile, to quote writer Margaret Halsey, my knees could have been stirred with a spoon. Faced with this, what was I going to do? I instinctively knew I couldn't magically erase what I was feeling. Fear of heights runs in my family. You wouldn't have gotten my dad or my middle sister anywhere near the Rio Grande Gorge, let alone the bridge. They also spent their lives avoiding small aircraft, Ferris wheels, and the top deck of Yankee Stadium. I have a milder case of this acrophobia, but it is real nonetheless. So, should I turn back and wait in the car? That was certainly an option. If I did turn back, nothing would be lost beyond a bit of pride. Emily wouldn't mind if I sidelined myself. The decision what to do was entirely up to me. But some part of me resisted the urge to turn back. Maybe it was pure ego. Or maybe it was my wiser self who somehow knew that crossing the bridge would teach me something. Whichever, I knew somehow that I had to move forward, and so I did. I tried walking slowly. I tried walking fast. I tried meditation. I tried deep breathing. I tried walking on the road to gain distance from the edge. I tried looking off in the distance rather than down into the chasm. I tried thinking about all the people and the cars who had made this crossing safely. And since I'm an earthquake survivor, I tried not to think about the seismic activity around the rift. Well, did any of these tactics expunge my fear? No, not really. It was with me all the way across and all the way back. What kept me going was simply this: the slow, steady pace of putting one foot in front of the other. Was it courage I found on the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge that day? Well, maybe, but maybe not. If it was courage, it certainly was of a minor kind. It's nothing compared to what we see in other parts of the world, most notably the heroic ongoing struggle of Ukraine right now against the Russian invasion. But we all have to start somewhere, and what's right in front of us is as good a place as any. Well, this memory is 25 years old, and yet it continues to be useful in my life. I call it up when I'm feeling challenged, when fear gets in the way. And perhaps you have similar stories, memories that can function like a little smooth stone you can carry in your pocket, a smooth stone that can remind you of times when you've been afraid, but when you have overcome fear, when you have done something that's hard for you. And in that reminder, maybe you can find the courage to do other hard things. I'm not very brave is a common self-deprecating assessment. I often refer to myself as a wimp. Perhaps we only think that because we subscribe to some misconceptions about courage. As I think about this, it occurs to me that there are two misconceptions about courage. At least two. First, there's the idea that being courageous means being fearless, having no fear. But many brave people will tell you that's really not the case, at least not always. There are concert pianists whose knees shake before every performance. There are trial lawyers, nothing to do with whether they are fearful or not, whether they live with fear, and rather have everything to do with how they manage it. Mark Twain once wrote, "Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear." More recently, Nelson Mandela said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." So, can we take small steps, learn to resist fear, maybe master it, maybe even triumph over it, at least temporarily? Maybe so. But for some of us, a first step on the path of courage might be even more basic than that. A good start may simply be to acknowledge our fears, to accept that we have them. By doing this, we might unlock mental energy that would otherwise be bound up with beating ourselves up for being fearful, energy that we can then put toward more constructive uses. Marilyn Ferguson once suggested that we might even welcome our fears. Properly understood, she says, they're some of our best teachers, a treasure house of self-knowledge. Knowing ourselves better can point to paths beyond fear or help us act in spite of them. And of course, it's helpful to remember that there are things we should be afraid of, or at least cautious about. People who fly airplanes have a saying: there are old pilots, there are bold pilots, and there are no old, bold pilots. It's worth remembering courage is different from bravado. Bravado is all about faking courage or ignoring our fear. A second misconception equates courage solely with outward acts, heroic rescues, spectacular feats of political prowess. But courage is also found in quiet daily acts of resolve, and it likely involves eternal struggle, internal struggle rather than external. I stumbled on an Emily Dickinson poem recently that expresses that idea. Here are her first two stanzas. To fight aloud is very brave, but gallanter I know, who charge within the bosom the Calvary of woe, who win and nations do not see, who fall and none observe, whose dying eyes no country regards with patriot love. Dickinson, of course, stayed within her house most of her adult life, so she knew what she was talking about. And Dickinson's words remind me of an admonition that I'm sure you've heard too. Be kind, for everyone we meet is fighting a hard battle. When we encounter a stranger or a friend, we have no idea what courage it might have taken them simply to get up, get out of bed in the morning. And that reminds me of something else. Words of Brian Andreas, an artist. Anyone can slay a dragon, but try waking up every morning and loving the world all over again. That's what makes a real hero. Try waking up every morning and loving the world all over again. That's the kind of courage everyone can practice, and for many of us, it does take practice. And it's worth noting in connection with loving the world that the word courage comes from the same linguistic root as the word for heart. So, what are some of the ways we can love the world? I think they are probably countless. A young school student loves the world when they go and join a child who's sitting alone in the school cafeteria. A person of any age loves the world when they kindly but firmly challenge a racist remark or a transphobic one and call the speaker to the better angels of human nature. You love the world if you don't get out much anymore, but you write letters to people whom you think need a little encouragement, or you write postcards for Vote Forward or You the Vote, or an environmental organization, encouraging people to make their voice heard at the polls. You love the world the morning after your spouse or partner has died, and you have no idea how you can possibly endure another day. Yet you get out of bed, you do the tasks that need doing. This quiet, ordinary courage does take practice, But every day we can nudge the boundaries of our comfort zone just a little bit and do a thing that feels hard or risky or unfamiliar. We can push ourselves into a place that leaves us feeling awkward or incompetent or vulnerable. And in doing that, we might help somebody else and help ourselves as well. I think of the volunteer work I've just started doing at a place called The Landing in Albuquerque. This is a local Episcopal church's ministry with asylum seekers. These are people who have just been released from detention and need a temporary place to stay. At The Landing, they receive a warm welcome, maybe the first one they've received since coming to this country. They get a good meal and a bed for a night or two. In other words, they get a place to catch their breath before traveling to meet their sponsors. It feels good to make a difference in this way, to offer this very small but strategically important assistance to people who've had a tough time of it. And the guests are very appreciative. At the same time, when I volunteer at The Landing, I know that I'm doing something I usually try to avoid. That is, I step into a situation where I feel awkward and incompetent, feelings that I absolutely hate in myself. They're so uncomfortable. And the discomfort is not about meeting new people, I love that, but about trying to navigate language differences. I thought I was reasonably competent in Spanish, but last week, for the first time, I really discovered its limits. And yet I know with practice that I will learn to live with that discomfort. My Spanish might even get a little better as I learn. And this is clearly small stuff, hardly noble or valiant, but I think practicing this small, ordinary courage can build us up for bigger things. It might even help fortify us for the times we live in, a future in which the survival of democracy is uncertain, not to mention the future of our beloved planet. Historian Timothy Snyder has a little book. It really is small. You can almost put it in your pocket. It's called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And it lists a series of acts of quiet resistance that we can engage in to keep democracy alive in our times and in possible harder times to come. His first one is, do not obey authoritarians in advance. And they end with, be as courageous as you can. In between, Snyder says, the minor choices we make are, in their way, a kind of vote. In the politics of every day, our words and gestures, or their absence, count very much. Practicing ordinary courage now can prepare us for the future when we may be called to acts of extraordinary courage. May we be ready. And remember, we don't have to face it alone if it comes. And we may discover that we are braver than we think we are. So may it be. And now let's join in a time of silence.
Thank you for those beautiful words. Today, I really needed it for myself, so I appreciate it. Our offering is an opportunity to share some of what we have with the wider world. I'll share the plate partner for this month is for the Los Alamos Family Council. 100% of all offered this month will be given to our partners. You can place cash or check in the basket that's coming around, or you can place the same in the box by the door, or use Givelify. May the offering music lift your spirits, and may what you give bring you joy. So I'm going to correct something. Reverend John will not be here next week. We will have a guest, our guest will be Reverend Gail Mariner. She'll be here next week. Today we're having the circle meet, the women's circle at UCLA. It's in person today? They meet in person today, right? Our announcements, before we conclude the service, I'd like to remind you that our announcements and information about upcoming events can be found on our website and our weekly emails, on our Facebook page, this month's issue of The Voice, and behind your order of service. And so I'm going to make sure that we give a shout out for our Asala and Spaghetti Dinner coming up next Saturday, Easter Hunt, Spring Cleanup, April 15th, and Butterflies. All right, and Reverend Sue will say something else about the hymn that's coming up.
Just thought I'd offer a word about our closing hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory. The words were written by Harry Emerson Fosdick, who lived from 1878 to 1969. He was ordained as an American Baptist, and he became one of the foremost liberal Protestant preachers of the 20th century. He gained fame and notoriety as an opponent of Christian fundamentalism, and he was an advocate of the social gospel movement, which championed the rights of workers and the poor. He wrote This hymn for the opening service of Riverside Church in Morningside Heights, Manhattan, New York City. Under his leadership, that church became and remains interdenominational, interracial, non-creedal, and engaged in urban social ministry. The year he wrote the hymn was 1930, a turbulent time in history with the United States in the throes of the Great Depression and fascism beginning to take hold in Europe. The hymn's prayer, "Grant us wisdom, grant us courage," speaks as much to our time, I believe, as it did in 1930. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and sing together. Grant us courage, ears to hear and eyes to see. This is the message of our faith, to act with passion in the face of injustice, to love with courage in the midst of life's pain. And this is the meaning of our chalice flame. May it empower our hearts until we are together again. Blessed be.